My little lecture is called Music of Cuphead, Influence, Inspiration, and Process. And so what is Cuphead? For anyone who's not familiar with Cuphead, I'm just going to give you a really quick overview. It's a game inspired by the games of the late 80s, early 90s, run-and-gun games like Gunstar Heroes, Alien Soldier, Contra, those kind of games. And the visual and musical aesthetic are inspired by the 1930s era cartoons, Ub Iwerks, Fleischer cartoons, early Disney. So I just want to play a quick trailer so you can kind of get the idea. All right, so any questions? So who am I and how did I get involved with Cuphead? So my name is Kristofer Madigan. My background is in orchestral percussion. I play in an orchestra in Toronto, Canada. And that's more or less what I went to school for. And I also play, I played jazz drum set for a large part of my life. I love big band music and jazz music. Never really did any writing until Cuphead came along. And so I got involved in the project I think very differently than most people seem to get involved with composing projects. Two of my best friends since childhood are these two guys. That's Chad on the left and Jared on the right of both pictures. And they're the Moldenhauer brothers, and they are the creators of Cuphead. And I've known Chad since I think we started grade 4 together. And Jared's 2 years younger, so I met him through Chad. And I grew up in their basement basically playing video games on their couch. And so 2012, 2013-ish, they had this little idea for a very small game, a handful of levels, that's it, called, it ended up being Cuphead. And the team at that point was really small. It was like, I think Chad was doing most of the art. They had one programmer maybe, one animator. Does that sound right? I don't know. Okay. So they asked me if I was the only musician that they knew, basically, I think. And so they asked me if I wanted to write music for their game. I'd never done any composing before, so I said, no, definitely not. You should find a professional. And they sort of persisted, and eventually I said, okay. Because I had wanted to get into writing, but it was, you know, I never had an opportunity, really, to do something for an actual project. So I figured this is a good excuse to sort of get into the composition process. And so now, this is what the team looks like as of last year. I think that's almost everybody, and now there's probably a couple more people. And the studio, everyone is from a different, we all live across more or less North America. A few of us are from Ontario. Some of the animators are from California. One is from Vancouver. There's programmers all over the place. So we work remotely. I do all the composing from home. And we work using Basecamp. And that's sort of how we keep in touch with things. They'll send me art, I'll send them ideas. So that's just a quick overview of the studio. So the things I want to discuss today are sort of the two big questions that I get asked repeatedly at conferences or online, which is inspiration. Where do you get ideas from? Where does the inspiration come from? And secondly, my own personal process. And I think a lot of creative types. I'm always interested in other people's personal process, no matter what the discipline. So I think it's quite interesting to find out how people approach what they do. So right off the bat, Chad Moldenhauer knew that he wanted a 30s, less of the typical chamber orchestra kind of sound that was common in those cartoons of that era. He wanted something that was a bit more exciting, and sort of vibe-like. So he was really keen right away. He wanted 30s style big band, up-tempo tunes, exciting. And so he sent me, this would have been, I think, around 2013. He sent me a couple of tracks. He's like, these are what we want you to emulate. Really obvious ones that I was already familiar with, but things that he had sort of dug up. The first big inspiration, pretty obvious, Sing, Sing, Sing by the Benny Goodman Big Band with Gene Krupa on the drums. So Chad was like, "This is, if you write music like that, that'll be great." And the other one he was really into, sent me Minnie the Moocher by Cam Calloway. Cam Calloway, very obviously the inspirational source for the King Dice character. But I'll just play a little bit of that for you.
Hey folks, here's a story about Minnie the Moocher. She was a low-down, hoochie-coocher. She was the roughest, toughest frail. Minnie had a heart as big as a whale. Heidi, 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 ho. Heidi, 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 ho. Yeti, 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 yeti. Yeti, 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 yeti. Whoa. Heidi, 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 ho. Heidi, 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 ho.
So that sounds familiar, probably. So sort of the first thing I did, you know, I was familiar with big band music. I love jazz music, but I'd never really thought about it from a writing concept. So the first thing I did was I just started listening to tons of things from that era. I've listened now to thousands and thousands of tunes from the 30s, just to sort of get an idea for what were the sort of stylistic definers of what that music was. And that was something that was really interesting about Cuphead. It was arguably the biggest challenge I found was writing in a derivative kind of style. How do you write in a style that is very clearly established, that has its own cliches and defining sort of characteristics? How do you write in that style but not just be sort of plagiarizing in a sense? Or how do you take those ideas and make them your own? Ragtime in particular, there's a bunch of ragtime on the soundtrack. That was really, the things that define ragtime are everything that I had nothing to do in creating ragtime. They're all things that were created by other people. So it was, for me, it was how do you take those ideas and do something new with them and original, still maintaining the integrity of the original ideas. It was always very important for us, for me in particular, to not have the music delve into parody. It had to be an homage, but also like a respectful approach to sort of rewriting the music from that era. And I sort of ended up, I felt, about halfway through the project, I realized that where my mindset was at, was that I was really trying to not write music like I was some guy in the 2000s writing 30s music for an 80s video game. I wanted to write music for Cuphead as if the golden age of video games and the golden age of jazz coexisted at the same time. So how would the composers from that era have written for the medium of video games? So that was kind of my mindset when I was doing all the listening and sort of figuring out what were the defining features of that music. There's a ton of, you know, I had to wade through a lot of really boring stuff. There's a lot of that music is super generic, and it was designed to be, it was dance music. It was supposed to be unobtrusive. It was still big band, technically, but it was inoffensive music for genteel sort of dance parties. So that was something I also had to like cut the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, and really get down to the meat of what makes that style of music. So I'll run through a couple really specific examples of influence on the Cuphead soundtrack before I get into the more general ones. The really obvious one, as we saw earlier in the Benny Goodman clip was Gene Krupa, the drummer. You'll hear Gene Krupa's style of playing tom-toms all over the Cuphead soundtrack. Stylistically, it worked. It was really easy. I just wrote 8 bars, 16 bars, told the drummer to play on the tom-tom. Fill lots of time like that. So yeah, so you hear that kind of thing in a tune like The King's Court. So that's kind of all over the Cuphead soundtrack. Also, I'll play a little bit of King Dice just because Cab Calloway is fresh in your mind.
If you haven't finished your class, haven't worked assiduously, no, I cannot let you pass. Don't you mess with me. Don't mess with King Dice. Don't mess with me.
This is the part where you sing along with you.
Don't mess with King Dice. Don't mess with me.
So that was, I was really trying to capture that Cab Calloway vibe with that tune. Again, trying to still make it my own in a sense, but taking the defining features of his particular style. And it's, it's pretty obvious homage to where I think we're quite open about where the influences come from and the people that inspired us. It's not just we're trying to take these ideas and make them and take them. We're paying tribute to these great artists that we loved from the past. So a thing you'll hear on a number of tunes on the Cuphead soundtrack is another Benny Goodman group kind of thing. Benny Goodman on clarinet, Lionel Hampton on the vibraphone. Really I love the sound of clarinet and vibes together, so I was like, I want to use this as much as possible. There's at least 3 or 4 tunes on the soundtrack that do that together. Oh, sorry. So you hear that in Sugarland Shimmy, you hear that all over the place. My favorite example is Threatin' and Zeppelin, the clarinet vibraphone combination. Next we have, I don't know if anyone's seen any footage of the Nicholas Brothers tap dancers. I came across some footage, numerous clips of them. I think if you Google best dance scene of all time, there's 2 scenes that come up. This is one of them, you'll see the other one in a bit. But they're incredible, and I heard that and I was like, the whole Cuphead project became this kitchen sink project of all of these different influences. So I was like, we got to have tap dancer on this soundtrack. So here's a short clip of them with Cab Calloway. The end of this clip is off the wall. You got to watch it. It's unbelievable. So I was like, okay, got to have a tap dancer. So my friend from Toronto, Alison Toffin, who's a big deal. She's big in the tap world there. I wrote a tune specifically with her in mind. And what I liked about that Cab Calloway clip is the way that the tap dancing is really sort of integrated into the tune. So I tried to do that in the tune Dramatic Fanatic from Cuphead. The next really interesting influence, the American photo player, Also, this guy, Joe Renudo, who does all these American photo player videos, he's crazy. He's got all these wild videos on YouTube. This was a machine that they had. They used it in the 10s and 20s during the silent film era, and it played the piano roll, like a standard player piano. But it had all of this percussion and organ stops and xylophone added to it. And you can play those by utilizing the manuals or the pull switches. So again, I saw this and I was like, I got to write something using this American photo player sound because it sounds amazing. It's insane. So here's a short clip of that in action. Also, like, there's only, I think, 12 of these left in existence that are working. There was thousands originally. This one is actually apparently from my home province of Saskatchewan in Canada, which is kind of crazy, but it was in some small town for many decades. So I wrote the tune for Coin Op Bop, which did not make it into the final game. It is on the soundtrack, though. I thought it'd be great to have that kind of sound for an arcadey kind of level. And then the last of the sort of really specific influences that I'll talk about before we get into more general things, Whitey's Lindy Hoppers, an unbelievable dance troupe from 20s, 30s, 40s. Again, if you Google best dancing ever, this one is the one that might come up. This is from a film called Hell's a Poppin', totally weird comedy. And this clip actually got re-released a week and a half ago in 1080p now, and it looks unbelievable. So it's worth checking out the new version of this clip. So I wanted to write something. What I liked about the music in this, was, as far as I can tell, was written by Charles Previn. I was not. It was kind of difficult to tell who wrote it, but I wanted to write something that was really riff-based the way this tune was. It was not. There wasn't really a lot of soloing going on or like standard jazz big band form. It's kind of just like a riff-based tune. So that's kind of where I got the idea for the Marine Corps tune. So if you want a complete list of all the influences, like I can't obviously, unfortunately, go through all of them. Those are kind of like the more fun ones. Everything is on in the liner notes of the LP, or if you go to our Bandcamp page, all of the thank yous and liner note stuff are in there. So that's kind of an interesting overview if you're interested in looking up any of the things that I was really influenced by during the writing of this. So the other part of the process for me, the second of three parts that was really important, was to really dig into the music itself, the written music. I went to the university library. They had a bunch of Duke Ellington scores. And anyone who does orchestration or composing will tell you that it's important to go into the scores of the past masters and see how they did what they did. That's really, like, you can hear it. It's hard to understand sometimes when you're hearing it, exactly what's going on. So score study is super important. So I got my hands on as many scores as I could. You can get a lot online now. You can buy a lot of big band scores that are legit from the era or really good transcriptions. That was a big thing. jazz theory. I had minimal jazz theory, so I had to really sort of start from scratch on that. And again, like there's too many specific influences to talk about right now where that was. But we'll get to that in a sec. Arranging study. Originally, I was just going to do the composing, and we had somebody else lined up to do the arranging, which is often a standard approach. The composer is not always the arranger of the music. And then when that person backed out, they were too busy. I said, we tried a few other people, didn't find anyone that was sort of a right fit. So I was like, okay, I guess this is a good opportunity for me to try and learn how to arrange for a big band. So also found a bunch of great books on that, and used that and did the listening and sort of got the ideas that way. And then also I read a bunch of books on the creative process of other people, like dozens and dozens of books on that, just to see how other people, not just musicians, but writers, or any sort of artists, how they approach doing what they do and how they maintain their creativity. And there's sort of the more you read about it, there's some real interesting through lines which are quite common with most artists. Again, not really enough time today to talk about it, but what I did was I kept a list of everything that I read and all of the creative books I read and also the theory and jazz books that I used, and they're all on my website and on my blog. And I've highlighted the ones which I found the most useful. So, I mean, that's if you're interested in doing any sort of creative work, that's maybe like an okay place to start and see, well, as soon as you read one book, you'll cross-reference 2 or 3 others, and you get those books out, those cross-reference a couple others. So it's kind of this never-ending pit of creative inspiration that you'll find. But that was kind of, that's a very quick overview of the other part of the process, was just delving into the theory and the scores and other people's creative process. So now we get to the 2 biggest influences on Cuphead. And these 2 musicians are all over the soundtrack in various ways. First one is Scott Joplin. Originally, there was going to be no ragtime on the soundtrack. It was just big band. Then there was a world map, and I said, I want to do something different for the world map sound. I don't want to write a big band tune for that. It doesn't make sense. So I started listening to a lot of Scott Joplin, because he's kind of there's a lot of different styles of ragtime. There's the New Orleans kind of ragtime, which is more of the Jelly Roll Morton school, and very loose and improvised. Scott Joplin is almost classical in his approach to writing. It's very elegant, it's extremely refined, and I found that, looking at Scott Joplin music, I'm not convinced that you can take away or add a single note and make it a better piece. I think each one of his works is completely perfect in their own way. So he was a big influence. And I'm going to play you very early, I dug this out the other day, extremely early MIDI demo that I had sent to Chad for what became Inkwell Isle 1. This is from June 2013. Let's compare that now to the one, this is, obviously reworked numerous times. Let's compare that to the piano version of Inkwell Isle 1 now. So 2 of the books that I found really useful when I was composing were 2 books by the American musicologist and composer Gunther Schuller, and he wrote a book on early jazz and he wrote a book on the swing era. Super valuable resources. He's a very interesting guy, though. He was part of the ragtime resurgence of the early 70s. It happened in North America. I'm not sure if it was as popular over here, but basically the film The Sting is considered responsible for, in 1973, a resurgence in interest in ragtime music in North America. It's not, I mean, much like Cuphead, which I believe is set in 1936, Ragtime is already 20, 25 years too old, but they still use it in the Sting, which is also, I believe, set in 1936. So it's kind of interesting. And so this sort of led to a resurgence in interest in ragtime. And Gunther Schuller, at the time, was teaching at the New England Conservatory in Boston. And he, oops, I don't have any, no internet in here. So he led the New England Ragtime Ensemble. And what he did was he took Scott Joplin music and arranged it for what he considered to be a ragtime ensemble. Clarinet, cornet, trombone, drums, string quartet, tuba. And so I found a bunch of scores that he had arranged, and I thought it'd be really interesting to do all of the ragtime music from the game in piano form and also ensemble form. So what I did was I went through his, I sort of went through his scores and had a peek at the way that he distributed each part of Joplin's piano music to each, different instrument and the way that he arranged it. So here's a quick listen to the New England Ragtime Conservatory. So I think this album actually won a Grammy in the United States, which is quite a big music award. And so I was listening to those, and I was like, it would be really nice to arrange these tunes in multiple ways, do them for piano and also do them for ragtime ensemble. So if you recall Inkwell Aisle 1, the piano version, what I did, I studied the way that Schuller arranged, and I created the ensemble version of all of the ragtime music from the game. I'm going to keep it moving here. Scott Joplin, check him out. Beautiful composer. The other huge influence on me for this was Duke Ellington. I can't overstate the importance of Duke Ellington just as a composer, on the Cuphead soundtrack, but also in general. There's a lot of people who consider him the most important 20th century American composer, and there's a lot of groups who aren't going to consider jazz in terms of legit composition, but he should really be, if not the top, really up there in terms of the importance, his importance in the history of 20th century American music. Something that I really like about Ellington is from the mid-30s onward for the rest of his career, you can listen to like 2 seconds of an Ellington tune and know that it's him. And part of that is just his use of, he has his own vocabulary. And that what I found extremely inspiring, because I wanted to write music also that sounded familiar, but also had sort of my own touches in it, in whatever sense that was. And he uses, the way that he combines instruments is something which is really distinct to Ellington. He's always looking for different sounds. He's always rewriting his own works. For every generation he'll do a lot of the same tunes, but completely differently. And something that I really appreciate that he does is his use of dissonance, which was, I think, more uncommon at the time, particularly in the 30s and 40s. It sounded quite harsh. So a really good example of something that I was inspired by Ellington is my favorite tune from the game, Pyramid Peril. And there is some pretty intense dissonance in this tune, and I love it. But so this whole sound, I was really trying to emulate Ellington. If anyone's interested, it's in a minor key, but that upper clarinet is playing the major third and all of that stuff, which is it messed up. The recording engineer thought we had to re-record it because he thought it was wrong. And it was like, no, that's exactly how it's supposed to sound. And so the last part of the process, we discussed this the other day. Tina from Studio MDHR is also here. We were talking about the way having a good teacher can save you so much time. Like, it's useful to work through problems on your own, figure things out. That's a really good way to get into it. But sometimes it's also like not the best use of your time. If it's going to take you 6 months to figure something out that a professional can sort of sort out for you in an afternoon, that's invaluable. So I was very fortunate that I found a really good teacher in Toronto who was willing to work with me on the scores. He's a film composer primarily. You'll see him a bit later. He's a film composer primarily, and he's really good at. We were going to have limited time in the studio. We recorded with live musicians, and he was really good at looking at the scores and saying, like, look, this is going to take too long to get this right. You got to simplify it. And he was right. Or like, he would look at a trombone part and say, like, this is not playable because it's quarter note 300 and it's going like this. He was someone who saved a ton of time, a ton of hassle, and so I think that's the third sort of part of the triangle is finding someone who can sort of help you along with whatever creative process you're looking to sort of endeavor. So for me, that was for the approximately 4 years I was working on Cuphead. It was really, I felt really immersed in the project, and all of these things. It was just total immersion in 30s big band and ragtime music, and that was, I felt, the right way to do it. We knew that there was going to be, I think after the 2015 E3 trailer came out, and there was a lot of buzz for Cuphead, there was sort of a bit more responsibility there, because we knew, like, this is going to potentially introduce a type of music to a generation or a demographic who was otherwise not really checked it out, not familiar with it. And we wanted to make sure we did it right. So it was extremely important to do it in a way that it works in the game, but also will inspire the players to maybe go back and check out the original music from that era, or to go on to the credits of the album and check out music by the musicians that are on the album. So there was kind of this added, it was a lot of pressure to do it right, but it was kind of an honor also to have that responsibility. And I think we've had so many requests from students for scores from Cuphead, and the publishing process is in place. It's just taking forever. But so I think that was also important, was just honoring the history that we were emulating. So something I'll talk about real quick. I'm a big fan of leitmotifs. I was trying to figure out a way in Cuphead to use a theme throughout to sort of tie things together. And in the big band, in the boss tunes, it wasn't really going to be possible to do that. But once we started having more world maps, and once we started having more in the way of incidental music like Pork Rind Shop, Legendary Ghost, those kind of things, I was like, I wanted to have a small thematic idea to sort of like tie the game together in a sense. And what that ended up being is it became known as the inkwell theme. It's pretty subtle. It was either Kate Remington or Emily Reese who came up with that term, and I don't recall who, unfortunately, but they both had interviewed me in 2017, I think. And I mean, you'll hear this motif, bum bum bum, throughout all of the world map music. In the legendary, like, I'll play a quick sample for you here. And this came from, Inkwell Isle 1 was written first. There was only going to be the one. And I was really, there's a waltz by Joplin called Bethina, sorry. Not Bethesda. My brain is elsewhere. And it starts bum 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 bum. And I was looking for a place to start. And so I was like, well, I like this theme a lot. What if I just like reverse it? It's not exact, obviously, but I'll take that idea and it's a good place to start. So I kind of flipped it around. And then it became, having this 4-note sort of theme made writing all of these other tunes so much easier, like having a place to start. It's not a great theme, it's not that interesting, but it's a starting point. And getting that first starting point is often, I think, the most challenging part. So here's, I put together a little montage of various inkwell themes. You'll hear this, you'll hear tons of the shit in the DLC also. Theme really, but you'll notice that after those 4 notes, it's a start, and after each one of those, it goes somewhere else. So it's just it was a really useful device to sort of just generate ideas. What did we do to make the Cuphead soundtrack interesting? The tunes in Cuphead are very different than I think most video games. They're linear compositions. There's not a dynamic element. They don't layer as things get more exciting. They start and they finish. And so we were trying to figure out ways, how can we take this and do something unique with it? And it occurred to me that we should approach it the way that actual jazz and big band functions. That is, on one night, you'll play the intro, and then maybe a saxophone will take a solo, and then the trumpet will take a solo, and then out. And then maybe the next time you play the tune, the next night, it'll be a vibraphone solo and a piano solo. So what we did was we recorded none of the solos in place during the session, and we recorded all of the solos afterwards. And what that ended up doing was that we had multiple mixes to choose from within the game. So that the first time you play a boss, the first solo you hear might be a piano solo, and then you die. And then you play it again, and you'll hear a saxophone solo instead. Same tune. And so some of the bosses from the game have 6 different mixes. 6 different versions of the same tune. If I recall right, there's approximately 200 plus actual mixes in the game, but there's only 56 tunes on the soundtrack. So that sort of gives you an idea of the scope of it. And that was we were just trying to figure out ways to keep things interesting. So here's a quick example of that. This is High C's Hijinks, and you'll hear, they'll say I'm going to play the same part of the tune twice, and you're going to hear a different soloist on each version. The piano. And so here's the exact same version. This is from the behind the scenes video. You're going to hear a trombone solo instead. And so that's, with the upcoming, this is I'm not trying to plug this, I'm just showing this for interest. The new IM8-bit budget LP release, which is 2 discs instead of the original 4. It's kind of a greatest hits. But what we did for that, we went through and took all of the solos, it's like it is in the game. All of the solos on this album are going to be different than are on the original album. And that was also a way to make it if you know, for the hardcore fans who want to like collect everything, it gives them a reason to actually want to buy this, because there's different versions of the same tune, so it's kind of cool. The mixing process, we recorded and mixed with Jeremy Darby at Canterbury Music Studio in Toronto. Jeremy is a legend. He's worked with Bowie, Lou Reed, Prince, Aretha Franklin. This guy's insane. The mix process, we were like really pushing to get everything done by 2016. Game got delayed. So we had an extra a year basically to continue working on the mixes. So we spent that time, the better part of that year, refining the mixes to get the best combination of vintage sound, but still modern clarity. I hate the sound of modern big band recordings typically. And I think that Jeremy did an incredible job of making it sound old, but not so old that you can't tell what's going on. So that was that process, the better part of a year. He also had 200 tunes to mix, as I said, so that also took forever. Because each version of the same tune required its own mix anyways. You couldn't just plop the new solo in. So that was the mixing process, very long. The recording process, such John Herberman, that's the guy who was my teacher on this, and he also did the conducting and contracting. The recording process, I want to talk a bit about that. Showing up prepared, if you're working with live musicians, is extremely important. I spent weeks making the charts look clean, making them easy to read. That was extremely important. The more prepared you can show up to doing a live session, the easier it's going to be, the better the music is going to sound, the more money you're going to save because you're going to work quicker. Make your music look good on page if you're using live musicians. That was kind of my takeaway from the recording process. I was super stressed about it until that first day was done, and then I was like, okay, this is going to work. But really pre-thinking the whole process and making sure that you're not going to miss anything was key. I could talk about the recording process a lot more too, but running short on time, I'm going to skip that. Does anyone have any questions? If you have
thanks for the great talk.
My pleasure.
I'm a primary sound designer, so I got a couple technical questions. You know, nowadays music is recorded with digital equipment, but in 30s it was probably some wax cylinder or something like that.
Yeah, it would have been on YouTube, yeah.
So, did you use any old equipment, vintage equipment, like tapes maybe, or stuff like that, or you recorded modern way, but you make the sound old school with the mix?
We used a lot of, Jeremy has a lot of vintage mics in the studio from that era. So we used, pretty well all the mics are vintage, but it was recorded on a digital board just for ease.
Right.
But yeah, and any of the vintage stuff was achieved through the mix process or any After Effects that were put on. There's a lot of record sound that sort of overlays on the actual music itself. But it was recorded digitally, but we used as many old things as we could, so basically just the microphones.
And I appreciate the effort because most of the music for video games is made with one composer who is a musician who uses VST instruments, digital instruments, and you record it with whole band, with live instruments. That's really great thing for a video game.
Thank you.
So
yeah,
thank
I mean
you.
that's Chad and Jared Moldenhauer. That was their decision. They were like, we're not going to skimp on this. I know when Chad signed the check for the very first sessions. He said it was the biggest check he'd ever signed other than his first house payment mortgage. So, and they did that, you know, that was fortunately because of them, they were going to do that. We originally, when it was a very small project, we were going to do MIDI horns and then would hire a rhythm section and play over top of that.
That would be terrible. MIDI horns are always terrible.
Yeah. No, that's thanks to them that they were willing to go that extra mile and pay for the real thing. So.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, come to the stage, please. We still have time for maybe 2 more, so if anybody has a question, please come to the stage here and wait for your chance.
Has has working with all this music made you kind of sick of 30s style music, or has it made you appreciate it more?
I appreciate it more. I don't listen to it for fun, but no, I definitely appreciate it a lot. I mean, I appreciated it before, but now I think I have a different kind of appreciation for it. So, but definitely in between when the game came out and when I started working on DLC, I listened to no 30s music. So
It was a sweet release, I guess.
thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Another? Yeah, come, please.
Hi. So, which stage of development did you compose the soundtrack? So, and what direction are you received by director? So, how level?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something I didn't get to touch on. Kind of because of the way the game was going, like I had no idea what I was doing, so I was like really slow. I'm still very slow at composing. I'm not like a quick composer. So the game was being developed simultaneously as I was writing the music. Some specific things were written with certain bosses in mind, or certain effects, like things on the train boss. The airship has a Final Fantasy VI airship reference in it. But other than that, a lot of what I was doing was just writing tunes that I thought were exciting, and then what they would do is Chad would match them up after I'd written them and say, this is going to work great for this boss, and then we would kind of refine it from there. So it was like, if it had been like maybe a more normal process where the music composition started later in the game, it still wouldn't be out. They'd still be waiting on me. So it was a simultaneous process, and some bosses I knew what they looked like, a lot of them I didn't.
So, there are so famous songs in big band jazz and Dixieland. So, why don't use the famous song in this soundtrack?
I think they wanted all original, all original music. Yeah, it's possible. I mean, it's also like I don't know how many of those tunes are still on copyright. So I think the Joplin stuff is not open source yet, and that's over 100 years old. I think, I'm not sure, but I think also it's prohibitively expensive probably to get a lot of those tunes. But they did want an all original soundtrack. So
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Time's up, ladies and gentlemen. Kristofer Madigan.
Dziękuję.
Thank you very much for this amazing...